Welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders. This is the show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate, and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by the wonderful Tania Garrett. She's the Vice President of International Employee Experience for Adobe. She's had over 2 decades of international human resource and leadership experience spanning various different industries, geographies, and worldwide regions. She's extensive experience when it comes to HR leadership, but also when it comes to M&A and strategic management operations. Welcome to the show, Tania.
Thank you, Leila. Good to be here.
Well, thanks so much for joining me. And, great way to kind of kick things off as ever, because I know we've had some brilliant conversations today, is, perhaps for you to share with our audience a little bit about the journey of how you came to be where you are today. Because I know there's, many different territories in the world and many organizations that you work for prior to joining one of the most well-recognized names in tech.
Yeah, so I think, maybe interesting, maybe not, but we'll go with it. So I grew up in a very small village in Wiltshire, and I am, the product of what I would consider a working class family. My parents both worked. I'm one of 4 children, and I'm very fortunate to have 3 siblings who I'm incredibly close to, which is an important part of my upbringing and an important part of my story, I think. What I would say is that, I wasn't privileged as a child in any way. My parents were incredibly supportive of anything we wanted to do. And I think that's an important part of my story, is that we were never pigeonholed as children. We were never pigeonholed to do something well or go down a particular route. My dad's kind of mentality about life in general was, if you try something, you must try it and really be sure if you want to go with it or give it up. You can't just try and give up and walk away. There are consequences to that behavior. But also just to work really hard. And my dad is an incredibly hard worker, and that's something that's kind of carried me throughout my career. I guess, what's probably most interesting about me is I didn't go to university. I chose to leave school and start work immediately, which was both good and bad in a lot of respects. But I was very fortunate insofar as my first kind of proper job, once I stopped messing around being a waitress and all those kind of things, I was a bilingual PA for a company, which was a coatings company. And I was in a truly male-dominated environment. All of the leaders were males. There were absolutely no females whatsoever. All of the engineers and scientists were males. And it was a truly male-dominated organization. But I never felt like a female. I never felt like I stood out, or that I was, either discriminated or indeed preferred in any way for being a female. I just felt like if I worked hard and I did a good job, I would get whatever came to me next. And I think what's important is that this was back a long time ago, as you said, sort of more than 2 decades ago, and I worked in an environment that was neither hugely focused on diversity and inclusion, but at the same time did it well. All of my leaders that I worked for in this company were supportive. And, I started out as a PA. I went to resign to go and work somewhere else. And this, kind of 5 guys got together and said, we don't want you to leave. We want you to do something else. What do you want to do? And they basically opened up this chest to me and said, pick what you want. You tell us what you want to do. We just don't want you to leave. And when I look back and I think, not only was I afforded that, I was also sponsored by, and it was a group of men. And I don't think they did it because I was female. They did it because they saw something in me that perhaps I didn't see. And I think I look back on my career and say, and my advice in that to anybody is find a sponsor. And it doesn't matter if you're female and they're male or vice versa. Having a sponsor is something that's truly, truly important. So I worked at the company that was called Valspar for 15 years. And during that time, I lived overseas. So I lived in Europe. And, that was something also that really helped shaped me and my view on my career and just kind of diversity and inclusion particularly. I was thrown into a country where I didn't really speak the language. I didn't understand the culture. It was, I think I just went there as an idiot 25-year-old thinking, hey, I can make this work. And it was hard. And it was hard for me to settle. It was hard for me to adapt to the culture of the country. It was hard for me to understand how I fit in. And that was really challenging. And you have the challenge of your personal side trying to fit in, but you also I had the challenge of fitting in at work as well. But because of my nationality and not because I was female. So that was a really insightful part of my kind of growing up as well. And then I moved through various different organizations. And I would say during that journey, what's been interesting is either the sort of lack of focus on diversity and inclusion, but at the same time, the sort of history of focus on diversity and inclusion. And, for me as a professional, my story is one that I've been very fortunate. I've worked hard and, which is kind of my dad's mentality kicking in at all costs. And I've not given up on things either, which is also comes from a lot from my father and how I was brought up. But also there is adversity, right? And everybody faces adversity. And I think for me, and I'll be blunt and honest here, which is I was harassed in the workplace as a female. I went through a period of probably a year where I was subject to some pretty dreadful harassment by a very, very senior leader in an organization. And I didn't know what to do with that. I was young, I was ambitious, and I didn't know what to do with this situation. And what I found was that I had allies in other men in the organization that I didn't know I had. And what I found at the time, and this is something that I've learned and it really shapes how I feel about diversity and inclusion and how I feel about discrimination, is that you can either choose to be a victim and suffer because of that, and either lose out on your ambition or lose out on your place in the workplace, or you can choose to stand up and deal with the situation that you're faced with and try and educate others around you to prevent that from happening. And I chose the latter, and I chose to speak up for myself. I chose to confide in some other people within the organization. And I think the biggest learning for me was that when I spoke up, the support that I got, the utter support, was outstanding, and all from men. I didn't go to another female to tell them. I didn't have a choice. My leaders were all male. So for me, I think sort of rolling forward and thinking about how I think about things like diversity and inclusion and discrimination is that people have to be afforded the right to speak up, to be heard, and to be supported. And I think that's something that I learned throughout my career, which was interesting. So a bit of a diversion on my personal story, but one that I think is important. And, let me wind forward to Adobe. So I landed in Adobe about 5 years ago. And I would say from being a female, being very much in tune with the world of diversity and inclusion, Adobe feels like a home to me. It feels like an organization where it doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, so long as you're contributing, so long as you're creative, so long as you're working hard, there is a home for you at Adobe, and we take it seriously. And I think for me, what's been interesting is sort of watching that progression of diversity and inclusion throughout my career, but actually now being in an organization where I can share my learnings, I can, help support and drive our programs around diversity and inclusion, but also help and support and drive the careers of others, regardless of their background. So that was a long-winded walk through my history, Leila.
Oh my goodness, there was so many rich things in there, and I'm actually thinking to myself now, where do I start unpicking? Because I'd love to revisit some of the things that you said actually around the family and around the hard work mentality. As we were speaking, it made me think of a quote that I'd once heard, and that is that hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. I too came from a working class family, and I think I've possibly told you before, I was adopted by white parents over in Hong Kong, and my mum worked for the NHS. My dad worked for a number of different leaders, entrepreneurs, namely speaking, before going into education. But one of the things that we learnt so much as children was to work hard and to try your absolute best. And, you know, simplistic as that may sound, I don't truly believe that you can be a leader without having that hard work ethic. And I do think obviously we're seeing a lot more flexibility now happen within workplaces. And, you know, obviously we've seen an unfathomable year with COVID and now flexible kind of working starting to become more prevalent, yet still working hard and having that attitude and that mentality and that focus, which you talked a lot about, I think is absolutely critical ultimately to success. But one other point I wanted to touch on was actually around this kind of discrimination piece, if you don't mind me saying, because what's interesting is, number one, the kind of the differentials between what allyship and also kind of sponsorship is. I think both clearly very, very important, but actually having someone, as these guys were that you described, having your back and standing up for you as brilliant allies. Does it matter whether they are male, whether they are female, whether they have 3 heads? Because clearly at the time, it was something that you were almost unaware of, if that makes sense. Yeah. You know, did you ever kind of think, oh, I am female, therefore? And clearly no one wants to feel they've got to a certain place or being positively discriminated against. Sorry, positively discrimination, rather, for reaching a certain level because of their gender or their race or whatever it may be.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're two very different things. To me, sponsorship and allyship, I think, you know, allyship comes in all kinds of forms for all kinds of people. And I think my thought around that is it's important, you know, the allyship piece, you know, when we talk about diversity and inclusion a lot in the workplace, and very often that allyship piece is forgotten. And I think the risk is without allyship, you create sort of siloed communities within either an organization or, you know, we're talking mainly about organizations. For example, at Adobe, we have networks. So we have networks for our Black employees, we have networks for our females. And within those networks, everybody looks the same. So we typically have all females in our female network, and as you would expect, all Black people in our Black employee network. And that's great because it creates a sense of community. There's an ability for that group to be able to drive change as a collective force, which is fantastic. But without the allyship, it becomes very siloed. And I think, you know, the importance of allyship and the importance of feeling that support by people who are different to you, regardless of your background or your gender or your race, etc. You know, these people are there to support you. And I think that having that is something that is fundamentally important. And I think more and more companies should be focusing on how do you build that allyship sort of mindset within your organization, because if you have an issue, you don't always want to go to the top most important leader, and you don't always want to feel like, you know, you need to go to compliance or whatever it might be. You might just want somebody that you can talk to that is different to you, but may be able to share that experience in some way or help you. So I do think allyship is incredibly important. Sponsorship, on the other hand, has been a career thing for me. And I think that's been very different. And that relationship with whomever that sponsor is one based on how do I get better? How do I develop? How are you as an individual going to be the brutal, honest truth around how I operate and how I can do better? But also, you know, in some instances to have your back or to sponsor you. And I think, to your point, there's a fine line. You don't want to be perceived as someone who's got to where they are because of, you know, favoritism or gender in my case, etc. But sponsorship is incredibly important. And I do that as a leader. I always, you know, make it kind of, I have this pay forward mentality. I was sponsored and supported. And I feel like I should always have 1 or 2 people in my organization who, not through favoritism, but as a pay forward, that I should be sponsoring and I should be, you know, helping them grow and develop. And so I think those two things they're not mutually exclusive at all, but I think they're both incredibly important and should coexist in leaders and in organizations.
This is such a fascinating subject. I could actually talk about this all day. And I love the pay it forward mentality as well, because I've heard a lot of talk of late about, oh, what's more important? Sponsorship, mentorship, allyship, etc., etc. You know, the way you spoke about it there is almost the importance of the intersect between all of them. I mean, arguably, with employee resource groups, business resource groups, I know they're called staff networks, whatever they may be called in different organizations. They are wonderful for that sense of community, as you say, but arguably, how far can you get when you're preaching to be quiet, for example? Yeah. Hypothetically, if we're looking to increase our gender diversity, how can we develop that if we are just women talking to women, or if we are ethnic minorities talking to ethnic minorities? In addition to the fact that you quite rightly pointed out, there are so many different facets that would be relatable to many people. You know, in my case, for example, I would hate just to be put into a female box. You know, actually, there's so much more to me. In the same way there is with yourself, you are not just a female leader exclusively, and that is it. It is the fact that you have had that life journey, you know, that resilience, that coming from a working class background. Really interesting piece as well on the university side, and the fact that you'd said early on in the conversation you actually didn't go to university, and that is still a huge bias that we see. Like, I did go to university, however I couldn't, and still, you know, it makes me wince a bit even saying it out loud, I couldn't get a job in any of the corporates, and I tried with a first class honours degree. So who and what piece of paper necessarily matters. I'm proud of the degree, but did it get me the job in the corporate that back then I really wanted? No, it didn't. The hard work and the tenacity from your story doesn't include a degree. How much does that really matter? It's just fascinating. And, you know, I must ask as well, because, you know, employee experience is such a broad and a rich subject. You know, you'll have seen so many different cultural, idiosyncratic details, I'm sure, over the years in the work that you have done. Have you seen there be a significant change when it comes to the way employee experience is starting to be spoken about in the context of diversity, inclusion, belonging, a really important piece that you mentioned there in relation to Adobe, and equity, ultimately?
Yeah, I think there has been a big shift, I would say. If I think back to, let's go back 10 years, you know, diversity and inclusion was all about hiring women or hiring, you know, people from ethnic minorities. And it was all about, and this is going to sound crass and I apologize, but it is all about getting that representation through hiring and, you know, looking great, because you can say we've got X% of women or we have X% of underrepresented minorities. And that was great at the time. But actually, as everybody knows, it took time for everyone to realize if you hire these groups of people, yet they arrive into an organization where they cannot succeed, or they do not see themselves, or they feel like they have to pretend to be someone different in the workforce. It doesn't matter how many people you hire, because ultimately they can't be successful and they won't stay. And so I think, you know, the sort of whole notion of diversity and inclusion has come on leaps and bounds. And I think inclusion and belonging almost now have become more important than the diversity itself, which I know sounds crazy. But for me personally, you know, we absolutely need to have diversity. We absolutely need to improve, you know, the ratio of females in tech, and making sure that, you know, underrepresented groups are absolutely present and important in our organization. However, you know, the important part for me is that you create an organization that is inclusive, and that people, we have a statement at Adobe that is, people come to work and do their best work regardless of who they are, and we create that sort of environment. And I think that's great, and I think Adobe does a phenomenal job in all the things that we do, and we're very open to, you know, having internal networks, and it's very employee-led. That's one thing I would say which we've learned, is that if it's so much more meaningful and if it's organic, and if the employees themselves kind of generate these ideas and generate these communities, and as a company we're open to them. And I think that's been incredibly helpful for us as a business in terms of getting, people to understand what inclusion really means. But I think what's interesting right now is I think we're at a tipping point, and I think that diversity, inclusion, belonging is now becoming something very much more societal. And there is so much external kind of discussion and narrative around diversity and obviously treatment of underrepresented groups, whether it's as severe as the George Floyd situation in the US, or whether it's gender pay or the treatment of Asians post-COVID or during COVID. There is so much external narrative that companies are now having to decide what do they do with that, and how do they play a role in either making that an open subject in the workplace for people to discuss or to have a view on, or even for a company to take a stance on. So I think there is this kind of blend coming where companies are going to play a role in helping change that sort of societal narrative and those behaviors. And I think that shift is going to be polarizing in some way. But I do think it's going to be the next interesting evolution of diversity and inclusion, and just how much force there can be for good outside of the organization, and what role does organizations play in that.
The word evolution in itself is possibly the best one that I can think of to describe what we are seeing as well. I completely concur on the societal narrative. I mean, it can be quite worrying, I think, in lots of ways, is how to involve everyone and allow no one to be left out or left behind, when there are so many different cultural pieces happening in the outside world. The kind of the world of business, the world of personal, the two are becoming ever more entwined in one another. Almost, it is pretty much impossible to ignore, which I think is, as you've said, there is an opportunity for organizations to step up to the plate, to recognize, to drive equity. Because let's face it, we'd love to live in a world of equality and equal opportunity, but really this is the recognition of that equity and how we can translate that into all of the various different facets of intersectionality, many of which we have touched on. But the belonging piece as well, and you said, oh, this might sound mad. I really don't think it does. I think actually, when you strip everything back, and this is going to sound a little bit philosophical here, but when you strip everything back, we are human beings, we are flesh and blood, we are all kind of souls at the end of the day. And really, we have inside us, a innate need and a sense to want to belong. It is a human fundamental kind of need, something that's probably built into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So actually, when you talk about belonging, as almost being at the heart and center of that, it's very much culture-led, really, isn't it? First, yes, diversity is important, but what does diversity mean? It means difference, ultimately, and that can be one of many, many, many different facets.
Yeah, and I agree. If you look at it through sort of the HR lens of things, I think belonging is, you're absolutely right. It's a human desire, and it's a human preference for how someone is treated, and then everything else kind of sits around that, right? So it's down then to an organization to ensure practices and programs and policies kind of deal with the inequities that exist, because let's all face it, the world created a degree of inequity, and I think over time companies and society is starting to sort of iron out some of those. But to me, belonging is everything in an organization. But even still, you can't have belonging if you don't pay attention to your gender pay, if you don't pay attention to your promotion rates of people, and if you don't pay attention to who you're hiring. So it's making sure that you don't lose one of those to another, if that makes sense. So you have to have your practices and your policies and your programs in place so that you can hire diverse talent, that your programs are ironing out any potential inequities. But then, you know, the heart of the company has to be around how do you create this inclusion, how do you create belonging. And I think the companies who only fixate on the programs and the metrics are going to be the ones that don't succeed as fast, because it's a human reaction, but it's now an okay human reaction to have. It's okay to feel that way at work, and it's okay to have that sort of level of vulnerability, where 10 years ago, people didn't talk about mental health, people didn't talk about well-being, people didn't talk about belonging and inclusion. They're all new to our narrative. And so that has to exist, and it has to be okay to exist. But the sort of infrastructure of fairness still has to be managed. And I think it's companies who get that and who can balance those two things will be the ones that do this the best.
Absolutely. It's an interesting juxtaposition, having the constant balance between the two. And, you know, obviously no company, no person is perfect, but ultimately, you know, I think we can all remember a time in our lives, whether it's personal life, whether it's work life, where we have not felt that we belong in that situation. Yeah. To your point, you know, if we aren't fixing some of those, you know, those policies, procedures around what is ultimately culture, then we end up with organ rejection for talent, you know, because talent is then, you know, not onboarded correctly, is not engaged properly, does not feel that they are fitting in, and kind of you end up going back to square one. I've seen it many a time, and kind of you have executives saying, oh, well, we tried to hire diverse and it didn't work, therefore we'll go back to looking at the same types of people. It's, you know, can't have one, I guess, without the other. I would love to go into a little lightning round, Tania, if that's okay, because I could talk about culture and engagement until the cows come home, as you very well know. Every time you speak to me, I'm asking all about it. So before we kind of wrap up, you know, just love to ask, and I'm going to start with the hardest question here first, to give you advance warning. What is your secret to success, or is there one?
I think it's different for everybody, I think is the answer to that. For me, it's been a couple of things. One, hard work, which I'm open about that fact, you know, and my team know that. But I'm also, you know, I look at it through the lens of, I don't consider myself successful. I consider that I have this kind of ongoing journey. And, you know, so long as I'm true to myself, and I think that's for me is success. So for me, am I working hard? Am I enjoying it? And do I feel like I belong? And if some of those boxes are not ticked, then I don't consider myself successful. So for me, it does come down to hard work. And I would say the other thing is I'm very true to sort of my own moral compass. So if I'm working for somebody or an organization that calls to question my ethics, is a big word, but more sort of my own sort of sense of right and wrong, then I won't be there. So I think I have, you know, an acute awareness of that. And that for me is my own success.
And what about authentic leadership to you?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, right? You know, so much talk and so many theories about authentic leadership. And I think authentic leadership is, first of all, a leader who is a human being that, you know, will put part of themselves out there. And it's not just this kind of work facade. I do think, you know, in this day and age, and particularly over the last year where we've had this view into people's lives that we've never had before, I think, you know, that will help with authentic leadership, because I do think there is a bit of, you have to bring your whole self into work. And I think leaders who can do that are, you know, are more authentic. But I also think leaders who listen and properly hear, in my view, tend to be really good leaders. And I think those two things for me are pretty important.
And finally, if you could go back in time and perhaps, I don't know, maybe it's you're setting out on your career, pre-working at the chemical company as a PA, which, by the way, I think is a brilliant way to learn everything there is. Amazing PAs go on to do exceptional things. But if you were to rewind back to that time, is there any advice that you would give your younger self, or indeed someone else who's in a similar position?
Yeah, I think for me, And I think I probably was, so I'm not sure. I think maybe giving advice to someone else, being curious is really important. As a PA, I had a choice to make. I either just did the work that I was told to do, or I chose to understand it. And I chose to understand what it was that I was being asked to do. And so for me, it was, don't just do things, have a curiosity, have a view, so pay attention to what you're doing. And if you want to understand something, ask the question, or if you're reading something and it doesn't make any sense, then also ask. And I think having that sort of degree of curiosity and bravery to ask is really important.
I think that's you in a nutshell, Tania, is the brave piece, actually. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. And actually, the brave piece is been something that has almost been interwoven throughout the whole podcast today, and is something that I think of when I rewind right back to the beginning of the podcast, and we were talking about your journey to being where you are today, is not being scared to put your head above the parapet, and almost being consciously unconscious of your achievements. And each time you move up a level, move an organization, of who and what you are ultimately. You've not let anything stand in your way, whether it being fixated on, being female. It almost hasn't mattered. Actually championing, celebrating, finding those brilliant male allies. I think that is, great for women and others. Actually, I think, there's so many brilliant men who are often in positions of power, who are brilliant champions and do care about the cause. But I particularly love the piece where you were talking about discrimination, because I think it's something which ultimately, the word unto itself, I think it takes courage to actually talk about discrimination. I think it's something that really resonated a lot with me, because I kind of thought, and I'm sure there's many people listening in thinking, I've had a situation, or may have had a situation, but have not wanted to say anything, not known who to speak to. And so hearing that you did it, you spoke out, you did not take that kind of that victim in inverted commas mentality, but you took that, you ran with it, and ultimately, saw the support come crashing in a positive way. And so what I would say to all that are listening today, by way of my little summary for today, is really being brave enough to step up to the plate, find your supporters, speak out. Your voice absolutely does matter. And really, which and whatever level of an organization you're at, whether you're stepping into the workplace for the first time or whether you're a seasoned executive, finding your voice and knowing that the value of your voice is important, whichever background you're from, is absolutely key. And then just finally, great conversation around the different intersects when it comes to allyship, sponsorship, mentorship. We'll probably put a couple of links into that as well at the end of today's show, because I think, it's really, really useful knowledge for others if you're wondering how to get a mentor, a sponsor, how you can be a better ally. Some brilliant learning points. So thank you ever so much, Tania. You've been a superstar. I really appreciate you taking that time out of your busy day to join me.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Tania. My name's Leila Mackenzie-Dellis, founder and CEO of Dial Global. You've been listening to Tania Garrett today from Adobe. You can check out all the show notes at the end of today's show. Any accessibility needs at all, just let us know. And we'll put links in there as well to Adobe and to Tania's profile. So don't be a stranger. Feel free to reach out. Visit us at www.dialglobal.org/podcast, or you can check us out on our app, Dial Global Network, in the App Store, where you can listen on demand at your leisure, or visit Apple, Spotify, or any of your favorite podcast apps. Up until then, look forward to seeing you next week. Take care for now. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.